Here we will compare the Genesis pre-flood generations from Adam to Noah with the composite king list. Again, we will do this line by line.
Bible scholar William Shea, who wrote the book Adam in Ancient Mesopotamian Traditions, suggests Alulim may be the biblical Adam, while William Hallow, who was professor of Assyriology and Babylonian literature at Yale, considered Alulim might have been Adam's grandson. For a number of reasons, we believe neither of these possibilities to be likely, although viewing them as contemporaries does seem reasonable. From excavations at Sultan Tepe, an apocryphal letter was recovered written by Adapa the sage to Alulu, the first pre-flood king. The legend of Adapa, who we do believe was Adam, will be explored in a future episode. However, he was said to be a priest, Apkallu in Sumerian, the first of 7 priests. He lived at Eridu at the time that Alulim was king. If so, this would be the first example of a king and chief priest relationship we see elsewhere in Mesopotamia and in the Old Testament.
No relationship should be expected between Algar, the king, and the biblical Seth, although they both may have lived in Eridu at the same time.
The en prefix tells us that both these men were kings, but not ruling in the same city. Enosh possibly may have presided over the biblical city of Erech, while Enmenlawana ruled in the Sumerian city of Bad Tabira, recognized at that time as the seat of power.
No commonalities can be seen between Canaan or his son Mahalalel or his grandson Jared with any of the listed kings outside of the possibility of Berosus, who may have tagged Mahalalel as Megalaris.
This king is also known as Enmenderan-Ki. As mentioned before, the king of Sippar was taken away by the gods and taught certain divine mysteries. Some scholars believe this king may have been the biblical Enoch, who was taken up and walked with God. Genesis 5:24. Again, the en prefix tells us something. If Enoch was a king, King Og, and King Menderanki was also king during a time when there were no multiple kings as far as we know, then in all likelihood this is the same man, with his name recorded in Hebrew in Genesis and in Sumerian on the king list. There is another possible clue. Sippar was the dwelling place of the sun god Shamash. The sun circles the earth in 365 days, the same number of years that Enoch walked on earth. Genesis 5:21-22.
The biblical Methuselah lived longer than any of his predecessors or his descendants, surviving almost to the time of the flood, which could help explain disparities in the king list if he is the same person as Ubartutu.
If Methuselah was king of Shuruppak, how long did he reign before turning over the throne to his successor? Was it his son, or was it his grandson who ascended the throne? Alas, these are questions we cannot answer. We do know that Methuselah was grandfather to Noah, and Ubartutu was grandfather, or at least a forefather, to the last pre-flood king, Ziusudra.
Lamech, who lived 777 years, passed away before the flood. Both Lamech and Sukerlim are depicted as an intermediate generation between the hero of the great flood and his grandfather. Where Lamech actually ruled over Shuruppak and Sukerlim or not is speculative.
The Sumerian name Ziusudra has been translated as he who laid hold on life of distant days, which would be appropriate for a man whom the Bible says lived for 950 years and even survived 350 years after the flood. The Sumerian version of the Great Flood, known as Ziusudra, also known as the Sumerian Flood Epic, recounts the flood in a manner that is consistent with the account in Genesis. I think we can say that the biblical Noah is the same man as the last pre-flood king recorded on the Sumerian King List.
The legend of Ziusudra depicts the flood in chronological terms that follow a similar sequence of events described in Genesis 6-9. The destruction of mankind is deemed necessary. Ziusudra is instructed to build a boat with an opening and load it with animals, whereupon a flood ensues and all aboard survive. An offering is presented in thanks, and Ziusudra is elevated at the end of the voyage.
Although gods and goddesses were part of the Sumerian and Akkadian culture, none of the kings appear to have been considered in this category. All are mortal. Also of significance is the inclusion of kings listed on the Sumerian King List in other legends, epic tales, and other literary traditions, some of which carry common threads. We see legendary figures in our own modern era who, while being actual people, were elevated through story and song to become historical icons. Davy Crockett, Buffalo Bill, Wyatt Earp, Wild Bill Hickok, all real people and all legendary. The stories about them became popular because they were real people who were already known. Although some scholars have disputed the existence of these kings, it doesn't seem likely that stories would have persisted for many centuries about these kings without a belief in their physical existence at some time in the distant past.
Other authors have attempted to downplay the significance of the Sumerian King List and how closely they think it may or may not coincide with the biblical generations depicted in Genesis 5. All we can say is that there is some significant overlap. If the kings are viewed as legitimate, then it serves to enhance the credibility of the Genesis author or authors and the credibility of subsequent biblical authors who relied on the Genesis narrative, including both apostles Peter and Paul, and even Christ himself, who referenced Noah in Matthew 24:37-38.
There is also a school of theological thought where it is believed the Genesis genealogies are made up, that Adam and Noah and all in between didn't exist. All of the early chapters of Genesis are considered to be prehistory or proto-history, a proposition we believe discredits the biblical authors. In essence, we can put stock in the legitimacy of the Genesis genealogies, supported in part by Sumerian scribes, who set down the list of their kings centuries before Genesis was written. In the next episode, we will look at the home of Adam and his immediate generations after leaving the garden. Thanks to my partner, Ken Miller, and thank you for watching.